Hello, and welcome to Viewing Like a Victorian, a look at the painting Man Proposes, God Disposes by Sir Edwin Henry Landseer. This video will briefly offer a thesis on the painting before explaining the background of the story behind it, and then interpreting the symbols and images within. The thesis of this evaluation of Sir Edwin Henry Landseer's painting Man Proposes, God Disposes is that it displays the fears of Victorian culture, such as the fallibility of man, the failures of Victorian morals, and the volatility of nature. And now a little background information on the painting. Let's start with the setting, somewhere in the Canadian Arctic near the Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage was at the time believed to be a sea route that would connect Europe to the Asian continent, offering an alternative to sailing into the treacherous seas found in the lower latitudes. It does exist, sort of, as a series of about 12 channels and pathways through the Canadian archipelago and Canada's internal waters. Dozens of English and British explorers have been sent to look for this passage, and by the time of Queen Victoria's reign, the need and desire to explore new trade routes was greater than ever. The Arctic was fascinating to the British public. It was, after all, so unlike their own little island. Bringing back images of newly explored places was just as important as exploration itself, pics or it didn't happen, so art was a vital aspect of British naval expeditions. Captain Sir John Ross, on an expedition to find the Northwest Passage early in the 19th century, created his own drawings depicting Arctic themes that were arresting to the British public. Icebergs that towered over ships, vicious bears the colors of the cliffs of Dover leaping from floes of ice. Bucolic, really, if you can't feel the cold. By the mid-1800s, the British Admiralty was all dressed up with nowhere to go. Following the Napoleonic Wars, the Royal Navy had at its disposal a number of highly trained officers and men with no wars to participate in. Their prowess in battle made them a formidable opponent that no one dared to challenge. Needing to shore up the empire somehow, these men were instead sent on exploratory missions by the Admiralty. This is how we end up with Sir John Franklin, former governor of the territory of Tasmania and survivor of two previous Arctic expeditions, leading men on yet another search for the fabled Northwest Passage. Offered to several men before him, Franklin was the first of 5 or 6 candidates to actually accept the offer to lead an expedition to the Arctic. To say this expedition was of great interest to the British public would be an understatement. They were captivated by it. It was, after all, funded by the public themselves, unlike other expeditions where men of means had provided the backing. When the assumed date of the expedition's return came and went, they grew more and more concerned with the fate of their men. The Admiralty would send expedition after expedition over the next 2 decades in an attempt to recover the men or learn anything of their whereabouts or that of the ships Erebus and Terror. Further expeditions were financed and organized by Captain Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, but his men and Franklin were never found. All that remained of them were evidence, discovered by Scotsman John Ray, that the men had perished, and worse, that some had engaged in acts of cannibalism in an attempt to survive in the harsh north. In an effort to discredit Ray and thus reinstate her husband's morality in the eyes of a Victorian public very much not in favor of the consumption of human flesh, Lady Jane enlisted the friends in high places that she had, friends like Charles Dickens, who called Ray and his Inuit sources liars. But for years, the British public had little to no closure as to the fate of the Franklin expedition. Their interest in the North never waned, and visual images were an important and growing part of a culture that was becoming used to consuming images of all types. The Arctic and the Franklin expedition remained a frequent theme seen in the works of the finest artists of the day, as well as the cheapest engravings printed in broadsheet newspapers. One of the most popular artists of the era was Sir Edwin Henry Landseer. Landseer was a favorite artist of Queen Victoria herself and was invited into her chambers to paint special and official portraits of Her Majesty and family. His other frequent subject was dogs, especially his beloved Newfoundland dog, Bosun. While some of his work was pastoral and light-hearted in nature, as he aged, his work took on darker tones and themes. Here is his 1837 work, The Shepherd's Chief Mourner, depicting a dog's undying loyalty to his human companion. The dog's head rests mournfully on the casket, which is draped in a woolen blanket. sending the shepherd off to his new pasture with both his sheepdog and his sheep. In 1856, Saved, we see his beloved Newfoundland breed having rescued a drowning child. In both images, we see themes of loyalty, obedience, bravery, as well as a darkness that's seen in much of Landseer's future works. That brings us to 1864's Man Proposes, God Disposes. This painting is still shocking to viewers today, as it shows two polar bears and the destructions of the remains of a sailing ship. Within the image, we see the bears tearing at items both made by and of humans in a harsh Arctic landscape under a dreary gray sky. To the Victorian viewer, additional symbols carrying extra meaning are visible. They are icebergs, a telescope, the polar bears themselves, the red flag or royal ensign, the broken mast and torn sails, and lastly, the human bones. Landseer was working on this when Frederick Edwin Church displayed his painting, then titled The North and now known as The Icebergs, in New York and then London, where it attracted a significant crowd and lots of talk. Both of these paintings were influenced by Friedrich's Das Eismeer from 1824. Unlike Friedrich and Landseer, Church had actually been to the north, as far north as Labrador and Newfoundland, and as a result, his works have a much more nuanced and accurate depiction of northern light than the others. But realistic or not, Victorians loved images of icy worlds. Remember, ice was not commonly available, so it was a treat in small amounts and a spectacle in abundance. Here the ice can be read as a symbol of the otherworldliness of the Arctic, as well as the region's treacherous nature. As strong as British warships were, they were still extremely vulnerable to ice and icebergs. Before voyages in the Arctic, they had additional iron cladding added to their hulls, and yet many still limped back home to England. At the core of the Victorian fear of ice is the fear of nature itself and the battle of man versus nature. This theme is reoccurring throughout the painting. The telescope shown here is haunting. It's laying in the ground, nowhere near the sailor or officer that would use it. This implies to the viewer that any threat viewed through the telescope's eyepiece was sighted too late. Victorian society was completely obsessed with the behaviors, tools, and procedures that enabled them to live a life separated from the harshest realities of nature. This is a time when the commercial availability of soaps, perfumes, cosmetics, toiletries, and other conveniences began to separate the modern world from that which preceded it. The harsh reality of nature and man's inability to stop it haunted the Victorian mind. The failure of technologies like a telescope would be a shock to a Victorian that sees their society as the pinnacle of innovation. The polar bears here are especially terrifying to an audience that had never seen a bear. They've been extinct in the British Isles for over 1,500 years, so they're a terrifying beast that exists mostly in myth. The type of firearms that were carried at the time were not powerful enough to take a polar bear down with a single shot, so multiple were required before the bear got away, attacked its hunter, or surrendered. That made them even more ferocious foes. The bears in these paintings were based on a polar bear skull that the artist had borrowed from the London Zoo, and their pose does bear a slight resemblance to another of the artist's works, the bronze lion surrounding Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square. These polar bears, like the icebergs, are another symbol of the battle of man versus nature. The ripped red cloth that the polar bear on the left of the painting is tearing at is likely the red royal ensign, the flag flown by the Royal Navy ships until 1864. Some critics have also read it as the red coat of a British Marine, an officer that would likely have been on board Franklin's ships. But it's more than likely the flag, the red ensign, typically flown with pride from the finest ships in the world. Here it is shown destroyed by a ravenous bear. I see this as a symbol of the impotence of the Royal Navy at the time, the most powerful and well-equipped navy in the world with no one to play war with, no opponent worthy of the challenge. And again, it displays a man versus nature theme. By depicting parts of a ship, and not just any ship, the Erebus and Terror were bombers, warships, as broken and disfigured, was to make a mockery of the British shipping industry. The industry employed thousands of craftspeople directly and indirectly supported logging, port cities, and the livelihoods of millions of people. English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish shipbuilders were proud of their works, and the owners and investors in the industry were likely to be among the viewers of this image when it debuted. British ships were simply the best in the world, and under no circumstance could they ever end up in a state such as that depicted here. But against the forces of nature in the Arctic, Welsh craftsmanship and Scottish timber stood no chance. This was more of that man versus nature theme. Human bones, seen here relished by a polar bear, offer closure to the viewer regarding the fate of the final Franklin expedition. In this version of the story, the men of the expedition befell their eventual fate in the battle of man versus nature by succumbing to the terrors of the polar bear. It's a gruesome alternative that's still more palatable to the public than the truth, that Franklin's men had resorted to cannibalism in their last attempts to stay alive in the Arctic. This is the ultimate end to the ongoing battles of man and nature shown throughout the image, and one that neatly ties up the story for the viewer, though it is false and disregards documented evidence. This work absolutely influenced future British works about the Arctic and the North, such as Britain Riviere's Beyond Man's Footsteps, which also employs dark imagery, harsh icy landscapes, and a big scary polar bear. Similar themes, similar images, but not quite as biting and haunting as Landseer's grotesque depiction. Like Church's icebergs before it, Sir John Franklin's widow was invited to the exhibition of Man Proposes, God Disposes when it debuted at the Royal Academy's summer show. As morbid as it is to invite a widow to look at images of what may have killed her husband, it's also incredibly Victorian. Lady Jane did attend the soiree at the gallery on opening night, but as she told friends, she did not possess a desire to see Landseer's painting.